This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
I found it. Look, I love ice cream, but I'm not 18 years old anymore, so I can't eat a lot of it. But I found it. I found a healthy ice cream alternative that actually tastes great. Sweet pea non-dairy ice cream. Get this. It's made with chickpeas. I know, it tastes great. Tastes and feels like real ice cream. Look, I screwed around with soy-based and oat-based products. They all tasted like shit. Sweet pea made from chickpeas is the first healthy alternative I've found that I absolutely love. I'm in DC. I get sweet pea at Giant Foods. If you're in DC, Philly, Pennsylvania, go to Giant Food stores. If you're in New York City, go to Balducci or Key Foods. In San Francisco, go to Nugget. You will absolutely love this. It tastes great. Made with chickpeas. That's so cool. It tastes great.
Former Congressman Joe Walsh, back with you on White Flag with Joe Walsh. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, White Flag with Joe Walsh. Listen to this podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts. I got to make one plug before I introduce my guest. Because I've been pushing it on Twitter and everywhere, this sweet pea non-dairy ice cream. Sarah, I'm going to tell you about this as well. It's made from chickpeas. It tastes freaking great. I'm a big ice cream guy. Everybody listening to me right now, sweet pea non-dairy ice cream is demanding that you show us your receipts. Go to your local Giant Foods, buy a pint of sweet pea non-dairy ice cream, take a picture of your receipt and your sweet pea pint and tag or DM me. The first 100 tags receive a Venmo for $15. By the way, if you're hardcore, you can be a special guest on my podcast, White Flag with Joe Walsh, by showing receipts for 6 pints. Sarah, before I introduce you, Sarah Jones, thank you, who's a senior writer at the Intelligencer and New York Magazine. I can't wait to sit down with her in a moment and chat with her about our topic. Sarah, do you like ice cream?
I do. I love it.
Have you ever had non-dairy ice cream?
No, I haven't branched out.
Try it. It's called sweet pea. It's made with chickpeas. Sarah, I thought it would be gross because I love ice cream, but I'm older than you. I can't eat tons anymore. It tastes fantastic. I can't believe it. And it's good for you and it's healthy. So if you run across sweet pea, Sarah, give it a try.
I will.
Thank you. Sarah Jones, I asked to come on. I wanted to speak with her because she wrote, I thought, a really interesting piece. I'm obsessed. I've been obsessed this last week with this issue of RFK Jr. He's out there pushing all this anti-vax bullshit. Should we engage? Should we debate? Should a scientist sit down with this guy? You wrote, Sarah, I thought, a really informative piece a week or so ago in the Intelligencer called Anti-Vaxxers Don't Want a Debate, They Want a Spectacle. I think that's true. Let's start, Sarah. I'm generally just like a free speech guy. I've been a very outspoken person, as you know. So when people say crazy shit, like I think RFK says, well, doggone it, I want somebody to go on that show and debate and defeat him and, defeat his crazy ideas. You did this piece. Talk to me about why you did the piece and kind of what you learned as you did this piece.
Sure. So when I started reporting this piece, I was definitely of the opinion that RFK Jr. is, to put it mildly, a crank. Did not agree with anything he had to say about vaccines. Where I was a little undecided was how to address the kind of false information that he was putting out there. What's the best format for doing that? Because I want people to vaccinate themselves and their children.
Yeah.
So I reached out to a number of experts just basically to put this question to them. And in the process of reporting this piece, I came around to, I would say, maybe a firmer opinion on the subject, thinking that it wasn't perhaps the best use of a scientist's or physician's time to debate someone like RFK Jr. on Joe Rogan's show. It sounds like it should be because we want to counter these beliefs that he's putting out there, but maybe not the best way to go about it.
What, Sarah, what sorts of things, as you talk to people about this, experts and scientists, and you kind of came around to that opinion, what sorts of things did they say, reasons that they gave you that sitting down with him on, say, Joe Rogan's show,
Mhm.
bad idea?
Yeah, so I talked to Daniel Loxton, who's a longtime skeptic, which just basically means somebody who deals a lot with people who are putting false beliefs out there, whether
Yeah,
it has to do with creationism or as opposed to evolutionary theory or something in that space. So that's why I wanted to reach out to someone who'd been in that world for such a
yeah,
long time. And he was really persuasive for me, kind of making the point it's very easy to lie, to make something up
yeah.
or to come up with a conspiracy theory. And it's actually more difficult to debunk that conspiracy theory or unpack that lie in a debate setting. He brought up that notion of a Gish gallop, which
I
was
love
coined
that. I
by,
love that phrase. A
yeah.
Gish Gallop. What was that? What is that?
So the Gish gallop is named for a creationist debater who really perfected this trick where he would get up on stage, on a debate stage, and he would say all kinds of ridiculous things. Like I think Daniel in the piece used the um, made up an example. You know,
Yeah.
the Darwinist agenda is going to turn your children into Toyota trucks.
Hmm.
Obviously, crazy things. But you can say so many crazy things like that in a relatively short period of time. You can pack in dozens of false claims into a few minutes. It's much more difficult to then get on stage and respond to those false claims and do so in your allotted speaking time, which means that some of them inevitably go unaddressed.
Yeah.
And that's a problem we're talking about maybe debating a creationist, but I would say that's much lower stakes than debating somebody who has anti-vaccine beliefs, where the
That
stakes are a lot higher.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you see this with RFK and others. They kind of flood the zone. They throw 100 pieces of BS out there in a few minutes. And as a scientist, or it's hard to like address all of them.
Mhm.
It's this point, Sarah, where, and it's in your title, they don't want a debate, they want a spectacle.
Mhm.
Like that's true. But again, then there's like part of me that says, and maybe this is the point, well, then give it to them.
Mhm.
Give them the spectacle and let's defeat them on their home turf.
Right.
But maybe that's kind of impossible.
I worry that it is, and I worry too that by putting them on a debate stage, you're putting them on equal footing with somebody who is an actual expert in their field.
Yeah.
I don't think that that means that we should never debate anyone we disagree with or have those conversations that might be difficult. But in the case of anti vaccine beliefs, there are real public health consequences for potentially doing that.
So then what, Sarah, then what do we do? I guess then, so like RFK, and by the way, I think everybody knows the background. So RFK Jr. was on with Joe Rogan. He said his stuff, and of course, Rogan didn't push back on anything.
Right.
Peter Hotez, who's a Texas based vaccine scientist, I think then approached Rogan and said, Joe, come on, what'd you have RFK on your show for? And then Rogan took it and said, here, debate him. Here, I'll
Mhm.
donate $100,000 to your charity. And then others joined the fray. And of course, Elon Musk jumped right in,
Right.
putting Hotez, the scientist, in a difficult spot. Do you think, as you watched this happen, Sarah, how did Dr. Peter Hotez kind of handle it? What's your thought on that?
I think he handled it probably as well as anyone could have. So his response was, yeah, I will absolutely go on Joe Rogan's podcast, which I think was smart. I mean, it's a hugely popular podcast. I think a
Yeah,
lot of people don't realize exactly how popular it is.
it's
I was taken
huge.
aback. It's
It's
huge.
huge. Yeah.
Um, and that's an important platform that you can't, just cede to anti-vaccine activists. So I think that offer was a smart offer, and I think it was really telling that Rogan was not interested in that, and instead he
Yeah.
wanted to kind of force a debate. And I think that was because he wanted to see RFK Jr. on this more equal footing with Hotez.
Is part of the problem, Sarah, like that maybe scientists and doctors and research experts, like this notion you brought up in your piece, which I thought was interesting, the debate setting is the wrong setting.
Hmm.
And it made me wonder, is part of the problem that doctors, scientists, and researchers maybe aren't great debaters?
Hmm.
That's not their forte. Is that part of the problem?
It could very well could be. I think science communication, good science communication, is really difficult, and
Yeah.
a lot of people aren't very good at it. Um, and so the responsibility falls pretty heavily not just on the few scientists, physicians, and other experts who are good at it, but on journalists who cover the subject to do it and do it well.
Like, could
I
somebody, Sarah, in your mind, and I'm not looking for a name, but are there people in certain areas who could debate an RFK Jr.? Like they're used to debating and they're used to the bullshit that is part of debating. I wonder if there are people in other areas that would be more suited.
Yeah, I would say probably in that case, you're getting outside the realm of somebody who's a scientist or a physician.
Uh,
That's where their principal job is research or treating patients. They're not spending their time on a debate stage. That's a politician's job. That's a journalist, perhaps, but not necessarily a scientist or a physician. So I would argue it's not necessarily something that they're as well suited to.
is it your thought, is it your stance that bad idea for a scientist to debate RFK Jr., a politician who believes fervently in the efficacy of vaccines, who may be a good speaker, a good debater, would that be appropriate? Or are you more of, don't even give RFK Jr. that platform?
That's a tricky one, and I've wrestled with that because I generally think it's a good idea to have politicians on the record in whatever scenario you can get them on the record.
Yeah.
And the debate stage can be useful for that. Not as useful, perhaps, for changing voters' minds, but useful in other respects. With RFK Jr., I feel like he is a bit of a special case because of the anti vaccine beliefs. And I do think that by anyone debating him, whether that's Joe Biden or let's say someone else entered the Democratic primary, which I don't think is going to happen, but if they did, debating him really helps disseminate those beliefs in a way that I think would be unfortunate and again potentially have real public health consequences for people.
Okay, so that's interesting, Sarah, and that's unique then here. That what RFK is putting out is so uniquely dangerous that even just engaging in a debate with him, no matter who's engaging him, is dangerous as well.
That tends to be where I fall, and I think we have to be really careful with that by saying that some
Yeah,
ideas are too dangerous to be debated in a public setting. But I do think
that's
this is a bit of
interesting.
a special situation. Yeah.
That's interesting. Then that then begs the question, Sarah Jones. And by the way, you can follow Sarah Jones, and you should, on Twitter at one Sarah Jones. That's Sarah with an H. Then that begs the question, and I'm thinking out loud as I'm asking you the question. Then what do we do?
Mhm.
Like, and you know my political background. I come from the far right,
Mhm.
and on the MAGA right, and I got out of the MAGA right, but on the MAGA right, the anti-vax stuff is huge
Mhm.
and it's growing.
Mhm.
And clearly I think there's some on the far left as well. Then what do we do? How do we defeat or at least go at this stuff?
Right. I think that's a great question, and I'm glad that you mentioned that these anti-vaccine beliefs are taking hold, especially in the far right. We have some polling to that effect,
Yes.
and that's really concerning. Um,
And I may be off, Sarah. You know better than I. I've known it's always there. because
Mhm.
I come from the far right. Do you think I said it's growing? Do we think it may be? I feel like it is.
Mhm. I have seen some polling to that effect where the majority of the American public is still pretty positive about
Yeah,
vaccines, which is great. It's what you want to see. But among white evangelicals, for example, there's growing anti-vaccine sentiment, and of course, that's where we see a lot of support for, as you called it, mega politics at the moment, and a lot of conspiracism as well. So it is a growing problem, and I think that makes it even more important that that we do find a way to counter these beliefs, and we're not letting them go completely unchallenged. I think Hotez's instinct to go on the Joe Rogan show was the right instinct, but if people like Joe Rogan aren't going to play ball, that's a problem, and we have to kind of go to other outlets. My worry is that
yeah.
science is becoming a victim of our polarization, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to reach people whose minds can be changed on this.
Okay, stop, 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 stop. Because every now and then a guest says something that I find fascinating. And to me, that's a headline. I loved what you just said there. Science is becoming a victim of our dangerous polarization. Explain that.
Well, I said that because of what we just said. We see these anti-vaccine beliefs taking hold, especially in the far right. We see them gathering strength. Um, we can look ahead to the Republican primary, and you can see
Yeah,
Ron DeSantis running on his COVID policies, which I would certainly argue aren't based on any scientific evidence about the pandemic.
yeah,
We have RFK Jr. running as a Democrat, though I would stress at reportedly at the behest of Steve Bannon and
yes, yes, yes. He
yeah.
ain't no Democrat. I mean, yeah, he's got, I'll tell you, Sarah, he's got Republican money behind him and Republicans pushing him and far right people pushing him. What's interesting is this podcast, because of my weird journey from Tea Party person to anti Trumper and outspoken Trump critic. Sarah, you and I've got, when this comes out on Friday, we've got people from far left to far right listening to us,
Mhm.
and I get, and everybody in between. And I guarantee I'm going to hear from some people who say, Joe, I liked it, but you and Sarah sounded like elitist. You're saying RFK Jr.'s ideas are bullshit, but then how am I going to know that? Like,
Mhm.
who's out there telling me they're bullshit and proving that they're bullshit if you don't want scientists or anybody calling them bullshit?
Mhm. Right. And I worry, I don't think that's an intractable problem, but it is a problem. Like I've covered this. I've experts I've found in my experience as a journalist are more than happy to give interviews to the press and explain the
Yeah,
science in a way that I personally find engaging and interesting. But if you're not reading those outlets, if you're kind of in this right wing bubble in this stew of like Breitbart and what have you, or frankly Joe Rogan,
yeah.
then that information isn't getting to you. And I worry that is why we're seeing kind of these results in the polling and we're seeing these beliefs take hold. But the answer is to just keep putting the correct information out there and like keep reporting on it, making sure that it's present. You mentioned that you had this intellectual journey coming from the
Yeah.
far right and now to where you are. And I had a similar one where I grew up in a very conservative home and
Oh,
had
you
some
did?
I did, yes.
Yeah.
I had some anti-science beliefs and like I used to be a creationist, you name it.
Yeah.
And now I've obviously come through to the other side.
Sarah, and like, that's interesting. So what moved you out of that?
Yeah, it was never a debate that did it. It was having access to the internet and having access to
Uh,
information that was put out in a way that I could understand and that was non-judgmental,
yeah.
about the place I was coming from. And, if I could understand it and it made sense to me, then, that's how I changed my beliefs. And I think that's a pretty common story for people.
Is there, is there, and I'm asking, and I apologize if they're ignorant questions. Is there a difference between anti-vax and vax skeptic?
Yeah,
Vaccine skeptic. Could you explain that, or is that hard to explain? What would that difference be?
I think it's an important distinction. So there are people who are vaccine skeptical, and one of the experts I talked to, Dr. Richard Pan, warned me to be very careful about my language. It didn't make
Uh,
it didn't make it into the piece, but vaccine skeptical people are people whose minds are just not quite made up yet. They've heard a lot of different things about vaccines. They may be parents who are concerned for their kids. They don't want to
Yeah.
hurt their kids. They've heard about vaccine injury and they're just frankly a little bit scared. But that's not RFK Jr. RFK Jr.'s mind is made up. And in fact, this is how he makes his money. This is this
Right.
is grift. Um,
Right. Right.
so I called him a vaccine opponent in the speech, and I would kind of put Joe Rogan in that same
I was
category.
going to ask you about Rogan. Would you say Rogan is anti-vax or vax skeptic?
I think he may have started out as a vax skeptic, but I think he's really sort of come around to RFK Jr.'s side on this. And I think again, the tell was trying to force this debate rather than have Peter Hotez on to give his point of view.
Yeah, and I think Sarah, like a lot of the voices in my former world of right-wing talk, Tucker Carlson, who no longer has his show, but a lot of those leading voices on the right during COVID, they were either vaccine skeptic or fully anti-vax.
Yeah, absolutely. And people got sick and some people died as a result of those beliefs.
Yes. And I always said, and I'm sure you always said, when, and maybe we've already done this, but when at the end of the day, when we take a look at everybody who died from COVID, it's going to skew toward Fox News listeners, watchers. Um, but how then, Sarah, how, and maybe I'm looking for a wiggle room from you and me here, because I want to, like, I envision somebody on a panel with RFK Jr. and they say, "How dare you, sir? Here's the science. Boom, 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 boom. You're wrong." I'm dying for somebody to do that to him, but listening to you, you're making it sound to me like that's probably not going to happen.
I think that's probably not going to happen. I think we kind of idealize debate in some ways as this vector for getting at the truth. And
Mm,
as Daniel Loxton told me, that's not necessarily the case. And that took me aback a little bit when he
yeah,
first said it. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, I know from my own personal experience, it wasn't a debate that I found persuasive. When I did watch, when I thought of debate, it was just a cheer for my side in the debate. It wasn't
yeah.
necessarily because I wanted to have my mind changed. Um, and that really started to make a lot of sense to me.
What about it? I mean, is there a nuance between a debate and conversation? Like, could a guy like Dr. Peter Hotez, who you and I have seen on TV, we saw him on a bunch during COVID, could he get on the Joe Rogan show or a show with RFK, and not a debate, but just a conversation? Or again, I know I'm pounding this, the very act, Sarah Jones, of doing that in your mind is not positive.
Yeah, I think it's probably not positive. I think with RFK Jr. again, you have that situation where he's an equal partner in the conversation, and the beliefs themselves are kind of getting out there. I don't think RFK Jr. is interested in a conversation either. I think one of
Yeah.
the reasons he wants a debate is so that he can come away and say I won the debate. And I think that's what he would say regardless of how he actually performed in the debate. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's one of the reasons Dr. Pan stressed to me when I spoke to him for the piece that they really want this affirmation. They want this spectacle.
Did you, and by the way, that's a really that's a great line, and that's a great point, and it's true. That is what they want. The people you spoke with, Sarah, did they give you any ideas? Debate bad. Any ideas on ways that we can go about countering the bullshit that's out there?
Hmm. So there are some advocacy organizations like Voices for Vaccine that do exist, and they exist to reach people, to advocate for vaccines, to reach people who may be a little vaccine skeptical with information that they need to make an informed decision. So there are organizations out there doing that work. I think they face an uphill battle at the moment given the media environment, but they do exist, and I think they're doing really important work.
You know, I'm going to be told by some people listening to us that you, Sarah, sound like an elite. You're an elite. And Joe, damn it, you used to be a populist hellraiser. Now, Joe Walsh, you sound like an elite. And I chuckle at that. But I do feel, especially like this with this issue of vaccines, there's like a real dividing line there. Like, oh, you know it all, Sarah Jones and Dr. Peter Hotez. You like guys know that vaccines are great, but you're not willing to sit down with us and have it at it with us. I hear a lot of that from people that fire at me every day.
Mm-hmm.
And they call you elites.
Mm-hmm.
How do you worry about that kind of dividing line that, or maybe Sarah, your numbers disprove me. Most Americans agree that the vaccines worked, correct?
Yes.
Most Americans are supportive of the vaccines.
As far as we know, yes.
And we're not seeing any change really on that, are we? Like even when it comes to things like polio and measles and all the rest, all the vaccines, we're not seeing some growing vaccine anti-vax movement, are we? Maybe it's early.
Well, I think it's a little early, but you are seeing that more on the right, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So lawmakers have come forward with a lot of bills that are sort of targeting COVID vaccine requirements. But
Yeah.
there's been some noise around other vaccine requirements for schools and for daycares, and um, so it's there, but I think it's mostly on the
I
right.
think the problem, Sarah, is, and this is why, look, if you and I are having a debate right now about whether we should debate RFK Jr., I would say yes, but I think you would beat me in the debate because you make a better argument. Mine is just a politician's desire to get on a stage and rhetorically pound him. And I just worry that the people you and I want to reach are not going to read any kind of research paper. They're going to be listening to Joe Rogan or Tucker Carlson or whoever, and I just don't know how to reach those people.
And I don't have an answer for that either. I worry about the exact same problem, and I my very great fear, and I didn't ask my sources about this, so
Yeah,
this is a personal fear, is that we're going to see some of these diseases start to come back. We've already seen it a little bit with measles, and it's going to take people getting really sick and potentially dying for people to come around on vaccines again. I don't want to see that happen. And, in order for that to not happen, we do need people to be informed and to make the right choices about vaccination.
yeah.
Um, and that's just really difficult in this media environment.
Um, I generally, Sarah, even though I have problems with Joe Rogan and the people like that, I'm a free speech guy. You know, the more the merrier. Go out there, and and you got a lot of listeners and all great. What do we do about the Joe Rogans of the world, or is there anything we do about it? Because he's, as you said a bit ago, he's got a humongous audience.
Yeah.
He had RFK Jr. on for 3.5 freaking hours.
Hmm.
And RFK Jr. spewed a lot of crap about a lot of things.
Hmm.
And Rogan didn't push back on any of it. And is there anything we can do about that?
Yeah, I think this is where Spotify, the company, comes in. And I'm also, like, as a journalist, very concerned about free speech.
Exactly.
So I don't pretend that this is an easy area where there are obvious answers. I don't think that that's actually true. But when we're talking about anti-vaccines, I kind of go back to my earlier argument where we're talking about something that is kind of
Public
uniquely
health.
dangerous, a public health concern. And I do think Spotify should have stepped in, and maybe even taken down the episode. I don't know. But I think at some point, it becomes dangerous to have those ideas out there, especially given the fact that we are still in a pandemic and people are still getting sick. You know,
Yeah, that no, I'll cede that, Sarah. That's a unique aspect of this is that this is a public health issue, and I gotta believe, and I think I'm right in that even now in Elon Musk's Twitter realm, he's got this thing called community notes. If somebody puts out a direct lie about the vaccines, I think Twitter would via community notes correct it, but there's got to be that mechanism. Like I don't want speech shut down, but I want I want lies corrected.
Right.
Journalistically, is that possible? Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, because Joe Rogan's not a journalist. There's no editor
Yes.
above him saying you have to retract this or you have to amend, you have to append a correction to this. We
Right.
can't publish this. So the usual safeguards are not in place at all. And I think that's one of the reasons you get these situations where his whole shtick is to come out and say whatever he wants to say, and that's what his listeners want. But unfortunately, in this case, it could get his listeners into some real trouble.
So, like, we have Sarah, and again, I'm older than you. I'm an old fart. You're young. We have a gazillion media outlets now, or a gazillion places where people can go to get their information. Again, I think generally that's great, and that's the market at work. But my God, there's just a shitload of disinformation and misinformation out there.
Mhm.
Is that just the price we pay, with this internet and everything? I mean, is that just what we have to live with?
I'd love to see more public investment in media, like an American equivalent to the BBC. I don't know, but like, or something addressing the hedge funds that are devouring local journalism. I mean, I think one of the
Yeah.
problems that you're looking at are these news deserts where you're not getting information out there to people. And who are they going to turn to if not, Joe Rogan seems to know what he's talking about. RFK Jr., if you don't know the science, probably sounds like he knows what he's talking about. I think that's one of the reasons it's so dangerous. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that there are potentially some legislative solutions there, holding these hedge funds in check, investing in local journalism and in public journalism is really important. Although, of course, as a journalist, I'm going to say that. Um, at least making sure that there's a healthy competition to these right wing news sites that are, as you said, putting out misinformation and disinformation. The free market, given it is what it is, I don't know that you can make them go away, but you can at
Yeah.
least make sure that there's an actual like news ecosystem that exists and is healthy and is countering that, and we don't have that right now.
No, to me, so that's a fascinating question. I go back to like Fox News in the 2020 election. I mean, they spewed a bunch of bullshit about a stolen election.
Mhm.
So that begs the question, and I'll get people on my left who will say the government should shut down Fox News. I don't want the government doing anything to Fox News. But it's an interesting question, Sarah. If Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity are putting out misinformation, what do you do with that? I mean,
Mhm.
they got sued and they paid a pretty penny.
Mhm.
But you raise a really interesting point in that this vaccine thing, unlike the stolen election, big deal. This is a public health issue.
Yeah.
That to you makes it a more serious issue, correct?
I think it does raise the stakes by a lot. I think I mentioned creationism earlier. That was one of the areas where skeptics really came into their own as an area where they were debating people
Yeah.
on the merits of evolution versus creationism. But I think they would all tell you that this is much higher stakes, and the consequences of how this debate gets resolved in the public eye are really important.
Did you, and I know Hotez experienced some of this, and you allude to it in your piece, the threat of violence against scientists. That seems to be a growing concern.
From what I understand, it's getting worse.
Hmm.
So I interviewed Dr. Richard Pan, who introduced a number of he calls them pro public health bills that are specifically targeting vaccines and trying to increase the rates of vaccination, um, or at least like sort of end the exemptions that some people were manipulating to get themselves and their kids out of vaccinations. And he experienced really extreme harassment that I think,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, is sort of a precursor to what Dr. Hotez recently experienced. There were threats of violence. There were people brandishing signs with his bloodied face on them.
Yeah.
People threw blood at legislators in the California Senate. Like, it was really extreme and sustained. And RFK Jr. was a recurring figure in the middle of all that stew. Um, so I think that dates back to 2015, kind of getting up to like 2021. And I think COVID just supercharged it.
The other thing I learned in your piece, it was interesting. I forget who said it, but you spoke to someone who took this example of RFK Jr. on Rogan's show, that this historically, with the anti-vaccinationists,
Hmm.
this is part of their standard playbook. They've done this for a long time in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a fringe movement that's tried to legitimize itself for a long time, and it's, sort of ebbed and flowed over the years, and I think hasn't always been as abusive as it is now. Hasn't always been perhaps gathering strength on the right the way it is now. Um, but did always seek that legitimization and saw debate as a means through which to do that.
That's the important thing, that even, again, well before technology, well before the internet, well before TV, in America, the anti vaxxers were doing the same thing, looking for the attention, the spectacle wherever they could get it. In your mind, Sarah, in your mind, is the movement ebbing or flowing right now?
I think it's flowing. It concerns me more than it did even say 5, 10 years ago, uh, where I think it was kind of once associated as sort of a fringe thing with hippies. And
Yeah.
I grew up in the homeschool movement to an extent. And of course, you always had an anti-vax among homeschoolers or the crunchy granola types who were a little
Oh,
skeptical.
yeah.
Big pharma, not always without reason.
Yes.
Um, but now it's very much a right wing thing, and I think is sort of taking on the characteristics of where the far right is at. And I think that is why you're seeing this harassment and this level of abuse that Dr. Hote has experienced. This is where the far right is. Those are the tactics that it's using, and I think that's another argument to me against legitimizing them on a debate stage.
Is it, in your understanding, Sarah, is it predominantly on the right, the anti vaccine notion?
I think so, based on conversations that I've had with experts in this space, not always for this piece, but just in general.
Yeah.
They do think that it's becoming more of a right wing phenomenon. Like, that's not to
Okay.
say that you don't have people who would consider themselves to be on the left, who hold anti-vaccine beliefs. Those people absolutely exist. Um, but where it seems to be gathering strength is among the far right.
I I'm going to give you the final word. I'm going to close with this, Sarah Jones. And this just comes from our different backgrounds. I'm a son of a bitch politician who's been out there punching. I just and every day I talk to regular people, still a lot on the right, and I'm scared to death because of not just the anti-vaccine crap that's out there, but a lot of other of the conspiracy thinking that's out there. And I just think, and you and the people you spoke with made so much sense that we shouldn't give them the legitimacy. We shouldn't elevate the person who's lying. That all in my head makes sense, but my heart tells me these people need to be shot down in the public square. And I'm willing to risk legitimizing RFK Jr. if because I think it's really reaching a crescendo, this conspiratorial bullshit, and I
Mhm.
think it's really dangerous. And I think it needs to be punched in the face in the public square. Um, I think that needs to be done soon. And I know there's a part of you that agrees with me, but I know your head still says we should refrain from that, even if we take a short term hit that we can't reach people for a while.
Right. I worry that the act of having a debate essentially backfires, and doesn't
Oh.
kind of accomplish what we want it to accomplish. In my heart, I think I want the same thing that you do. I'd love to see someone just shoot him down and have the final word and like persuade people. Like, this is absolutely my dream. I would love to see that happen. I'm just not convinced that my dream is achievable.
Like what would that's Sarah? So like Hotez goes on and he debates with RFK Jr. and you watch it, and oh my God, it's a debacle. It's a disaster, complete backfire. What does that look like to you? What would that mean to you? What would be the result of that? A
I think
complete backfire.
I think it would be a disaster. I mean, I really think um, people are
Meaning,
already.
Meaning more people might even question vaccines.
That's the worst case scenario. I don't know how likely that is, but I do think that that is the worst case scenario for me anyway.
And certainly, in if it were a disaster and backfired, the anti-vaccine people, their views would just harden, which is bad.
Yeah, I worry about that too because you do want to reach people and change their minds as much as you can, especially on an issue like this. I think that's natural for if you're a person of conviction of any sort, but especially when we're talking about public health issues like vaccines.
Hey, and don't answer this if you don't. I got two final questions for you. I'm curious. Your family, the some of the stuff that you got out of that you were raised with, and I don't want names. I'm just curious. Like, do you still speak to some of them, and do we avoid politics? How do you handle all that?
We're on really good terms, actually. My parents, I'm very fortunate. My parents are very pro public health when it comes to vaccines.
Cool.
They're never Trump conservatives themselves.
Oh,
So
cool.
yeah, so we don't avoid politics, but I do think about some of the other people that I grew up with, went to
Yeah.
college with, who were very much in that world. And while we may not agree, I don't want them to come to harm. And I worry that with these conspiratorial beliefs, especially around public health, that that's what will happen.
Um, Last question, Sarah. Are you? I'm generally kind of bearish on America, and I worry for America. But on this issue in particular, and I guess brought more broadly, the conspiracies, the conspiratorial mindset. Are you bearish or bullish that we can get through some of this stuff, or are we in for a tough road? You think for a while?
I think it's going to be a tough road for a while. I do think we can get through it. I have to have that optimism as somebody who's on the left, I think.
Yeah.
I want to believe that someday the views that are important to me and the policies that are important to me might have their day in the sun and succeed. So I need to believe that, but I do think we're in for a really difficult spell, and I worry a lot about where we are and where we might be headed in the near future.
You don't think, like I think RFK Jr. is just running for president just to give his some of his bullshit ideas a platform.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like he's not going to go anywhere in the Democratic primary. I can't imagine.
No, and he originally I think he was polling around 20%, and that seems to be mostly on name recognition. Those polling numbers have dropped for him the longer he's been in the race.
I bet you $1 million, Sarah Jones, that he'll be speaking at the Republican convention next year. I
I He's speaking at the Moms for Liberty summit this
I
week, I
saw.
believe. Yeah,
I
so
saw.
I believe that that's possible.
Hey, Sarah Jones, follow her on Twitter at ONE Sarah. That's with Sarah with an H. One Sarah Jones. She's a great follow. She writes good, interesting stuff all the time. Catch her stuff at The Intelligencer and at New York Magazine. Great piece from last week. Anti-vaxxers don't want a debate. They want a spectacle. June 24th. Read it. Sarah, you're wonderful. This has been really fun and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.